Okay, so let's return to our syllabus. I will share in the link. We covered a lot last time. Here it is. Last time we covered Roman numeral 4 and Roman numeral 4 and Roman numeral 5. So really now we're up to Roman numeral 6. Oh, we did. I feel like did we do that also? I think we feel like we did that also, right? We did 6 as well last time too. I'm pretty sure we did actually. So we talked about brachot before and after food. We talked about brachot upon seeing natural phenomenon and things like that, and brachot about using the toilet. And okay, laws of Nida, Roman numeral 7. I'm not going to cover because Sarah teaches a Hilchot Nida class for the shul once a year through her role as the mikveh director. It's designed for couples, so when it becomes, if and when it becomes relevant, you can take that class, and it's a free class for members of the shul, and others can pay to take it. And she usually offers it after Pesach, that once a year to groups of couples, and that's free to members. And if you can also, whatever, if you need a class more urgently, you can pay her. And she also teaches people at other times of the year as well. So I don't cover that in this course. Let's talk about Roman numeral 8 and some things about philosophy. Who is God? What is the Torah? Okay. So sort of interesting, I'd say we don't talk enough about God as Jews. I think we are very comfortable talking about mitzvot and talking about like how to do them and talking about the Torah. And I think we often shy away from talking about God. And I think that that's probably a disservice. I think that impoverishes our spiritual life, that we don't invest in a real relationship with God. I think part of that is a product as well of our like refined monotheism. Okay, Maimonides famously kind of adopted a doctrine of like negative attributes. We can't really say anything about God because to use human language to describe God is limiting, or to use the same. How do you say? You say God is big or great. Like a mountain is big. Or God, like the scale. I mean, we use the same words to describe things that are very different. We say it's a big onion, and we say that's a big mountain. Okay, and those are very different meanings of the word big. So even the more so to talk about God as being great, and so to use the same word to describe God as we used to describe the finite things that we experience in life is really a disservice in a profound way. But that's what we do. So Rambam says, really what we're saying is, Maimonides says, we're really saying God is, you can say what God isn't. Okay, God is not weak. God is not mortal. God is not limited by time, and God is not limited by capacity, and God is not cruel. Right? So we can say what God isn't. We can't really use any positive attributes to describe God. And so this is called the theology of negative attributes. And I think it has like a lot of like philosophical justification, or philosophically, I sort of see why it seems like philosophically seems like well argued and well demonstrated, but it can really lead to a impoverished spiritual life. If like, who are we having a relationship with? Who am I praying to? What am I, if there's Maimonidean God who can't be changed by, right? If God is perfect, God can't be changed. So like, God can't, to imagine God as having feelings and responding to my prayer and having feelings of compassion for Maimonides, that's idolatrous, right? It's limiting God in such a profound way that it's akin to like polytheistic idolatry, because I'm imagining God in my own image in a really limiting way. On the other hand, so if you have this like philosophically very correct doctrine, like it can just, your prayer life is like, why am I praying? Who do I have a relationship with? Like what's this, what's on the other end? And I tend to side, I think most Jews do as well, tend to side with like striving for intimacy with God, even at the expense of philosophical rigor. A friend made that recommendation to me many years ago, 15 years ago. And I kind of appreciate what Maimonides was trying to do, like a philosophically correct understanding of God that, but also like an understanding of God that is capable of like being in relationship with a human being, and that I can, right, and my prayers can be directed towards a personality that's capable of feelings, right? Uh, that being said, I think the Maimonidean push against paganism, against idolatry, right? It's God does not have a body. God does not have simple emotions. God is not, you can't bargain with God. I think that all of those like insights of philosophy and generating a mature religious perspective. Right? According to Maimonides, right? If you think I'm going to do mitzvah and God's going to smile and be so proud of me for doing a mitzvah, okay, Maimonides would say that's paganism. Okay, that's worse. That's like the worst low, right? Because God is perfect. God doesn't like God's perfect. God's not going to be impacted by your mitzvah. God doesn't need you to do anything, right? Okay. So I don't know. So like, so I feel like, so I don't know. Personally, again, being very personal here, I just feel like torn between like those kind of those poles of kind of really appreciating what Maimonides tried to do, and the maturity and the philosophical sophistication and the purity of what he was trying to teach us how to like think and feel. And on the other hand, such a strong need for, for a vibrant prayer life that is directed at, addressing someone who's listening, right? Who's yearning for relationship as I am. Right. And Maimonides is very passionate in his, speaks about love of God, speaks of awe of God in very, very poetic terms, but God is perfect. So God's not changing because of you. God doesn't need your mitzvah. Right. Any reaction to what I said? Questions, comments? If you're in any readings of Maimonides that allow you to,
I did have a thought or kind of a question.
Yeah.
The religious tradition that I was raised in, prayer, I guess I was taught to like picture speaking to, a
Yeah.
personified father, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I've started to try and daven, and like I try to daven Chakarita every day, which is it's hard and it's in English, but when I'm saying like the Amidah and we're entering God's presence and I'm really trying to
Yeah.
have this connection, I'm really trying to like feel like I'm in a divine presence. And I what do you picture? How are you just really focusing on the words? Because my mind is immediately to enter the presence of a human like being and like, you know what I mean, and petition my,
Yeah.
so like I don't know. How is that? How do you maybe go about that?
Yeah. So I think the trick is to, again, if you're imagining you're praying to an old man with a long white beard, like that's idolatrous, right? That's literally idolatrous. It's an image of a human, no less, right? And you're praying to that. That is idolatry. Okay, that's really bad. But so it's about feeling God's presence without imagining a person, right? An image of a person, right? I think some traditional Jewish meditation, spiritual meditations focus on the name of God and doing visual meditations around the letters of God's name. So that's like one tradition that exists. And I think the other, and again, so it's about the presence without the image. There's a rabbi named Dov Zinger, his book, I'll share the link. It's called, what's it called? It's called Prayer Recipe in English. Cool book. Prepare my recipes to awaken the soul. Okay, let me find a better link for it. Here it is. So it's a Hebrew and an English version. So he has all these exercises about like how to like cultivate your prayer life and improve your prayers, etc. And his one exercise that he recommends is to like sensitize yourself to being in the presence of God by sensitizing yourself to being in the presence of another person. So he says like you should close your eyes and sit in a room with another person and just feel their presence and their existence and sensitize yourself, like develop the capacity to feel the presence of another. And he says, you should say, ata, right? You are, right? Address that person. Ata, I know you're there. Your presence is felt. I'm just acknowledging I'm in the presence of another being. Ata, ata. And then the person who's like experiencing being felt and being perceived can then say, ani, like I am, or anochi, I am. Okay. And just like do that for a while. That's like his recommendation, like to try to cultivate that, that like consciousness of like I'm in the presence of another, and that he feels that that's like one like technique for like cultivating one's prayer. He's a wild guy. He has like a high school for boys that he directs, like really focused on spiritual education in a remarkable.
Really helpful. That's actually very, very helpful. So thank you.
Oh, okay, cool. Okay. Okay. So God has no body, God doesn't die, God isn't born, God doesn't have human emotions per se. That's sorry. Where were those? Okay. I lost my, hold on, sorry, I lost the, here it is. Okay, what's the Torah? So we spoke already in the very beginning about like, the history of the Torah. Torah came from God, the written Torah, the oral Torah. I don't want to repeat, but like, because like that's like the first couple of lectures, but like a sort of distinctive belief of Judaism is that in addition to the written Torah, we have the oral Torah, which there are different ways of understanding the relationship of the oral Torah. I mean, basically the oral Torah, like the simple one line explanation, the oral Torah is the explanation of the written Torah. The oral Torah allows us to make use of the written Torah. They both come from God. Okay, it's very nice. So what does that mean? That means God, I don't know, like, so on one range is like God gave like these long lectures to Moshe that he transmitted about how to be a Jew and how to do mitzvot. And the written Torah is like the summary, also from God, but it's a summary of those notes, of those lectures. So it's like you read the written Torah and like you remember, oh yeah, I remember I was at that lecture. I remember it says keep Shabbos. I remember all the laws of Shabbos and the 39 melachot and the toladot and the derivatives and pour make my tea and a cliche. Like, I remember all of that, when the Torah says don't, keep Shabbos. So that's one way to understand it. Another way to understand it is that God gave us the written Torah, and then God gave us some like basic principles of like go and charged us with a mandate to interpret this written Torah. And so the oral Torah is the product of this human response to this divine mandate to interpret the written Torah and figure out what it's telling us. In which case, all the midrashim that kind of unpack and figure out and work through the meaning, the legal meaning, the normative meaning of the written Torah are also like are actually generative and creative and are the origins of those mitzvot. They weren't necessarily known before. And there are lots of other opinions. The book, How Do We Know This, by Jay Harris, which I think I wrote on elsewhere in the syllabus, it is like the history of Midrash Halacha, the history of how Jews have thought about the relationship between the written Torah and the oral Torah. Okay, but your on one foot answer is the oral Torah explains the written Torah is very terse. It doesn't give us enough information to live our lives. The oral Torah fills in enough details that we can actually follow and do. Okay, and they're all obligatory. They all are divine in some capacity. Heavy topics. Role of Jews and non-Jews. Look, every human being. So I'll tell you what I think. Every human being is created in the image of God. I think ultimately, like God's purpose in creating the universe, every human being has a role to play in that and is part of God's purpose in creating the universe. What's the purpose of like Jews? Why are Jews? So that's like last week's parsha, maybe. Okay, like the first chapters of the Torah, God has a relationship with all humanity and it doesn't work out so well. So God starts out with Noah, and then it doesn't work out so well, and the Tower of Babel gets built, and God's okay. I'm going to split everyone up and give everyone different languages and go all different places, and that way you're not all going to become corrupt again at the same time, because we each have like different influences and have your own history. Each of these all human members of the human family. And then God turned to Abraham, and then God discovered Abraham and turned to Abraham and said, okay, I'm going to have a special relationship with, to jumpstart, to be to kind of eventually make possible all humanity having a, like acknowledgement of God and living a righteous lifestyle. And so Abraham and his family is like the example of that. Okay, but the purpose is for every human being has, sort of equally holy, equally sacred, and has that equal capacity to, and has an equal place in God's plan. It's just that God really liked Abraham and thought he was, like, okay, like, I'll work with you on behalf of all humanity. The Torah describes the Jewish people as Mamlechet Kohanim, a nation of priests. So maybe that's interesting. Just as the priest is to the Israelite, so to the Israel is to humanity. Okay, so the priest is the representative of God to the people. The priest is the representative of the people for God, and is sort of serving in this intermediary role, is sort of serving on behalf of, a conduit of blessing from God to the people, and is sort of directing the people's prayer and worship towards God. And that's our role vis-a-vis humanity. Okay, so it's a service role. It's a unique role, but it's on behalf of and in service of all humanity. Okay, not everyone thinks this way. Okay, there are other ideologies that are much more sort of invested in a kind of Jewish superiority. I think those are counter to the plain sense meaning of the Torah, and I think are ethically problematic as well. And I don't, but those are like dominant. It's like the Maharal had these ideas, and the Yehuda Levi and the Kuzari has these ideas. Chabad very, very heavily has these ideas. There's something different about the soul of a Jew. I don't think that's true. I don't think Jews and Gentiles have different hardware. I think we have different software. Okay, it's another metaphor. Okay, same hardware, just different software. Our software is the Torah. Okay, but the hardware is the same. And I think that's not. But Chabad thinks otherwise, and there's some other ideologies of the centuries that have thought otherwise as well. So I'm just sort of saying that you may encounter these ideas, but I don't know. I think what I shared with you is what I think is true. So that's why I shared it. Reward and punishment in this world and the next. So there's a foundational belief of Judaism that there is reward and punishment that does exist. Doesn't seem to happen in this world. Okay. And that's actually also like the dominant position of the Talmud, schar mitzvah v'hayla maleka. You can't expect any reward for mitzvah in this world. Okay, but there is ultimately, in the end of days and after, in the afterlife, there is consequences for mitzvah observance, but it's not something we can expect or to see here and now. That's like a hard thing for people to believe. People want to kind of have more tangible justice. The world, the Torah describes a world where God's presence is more manifest and there is more like instant and immediate and worldly reward and punishment. That's not the world we live in. Again, that's the Talmud schar mitzvah v'hayla. I think that's the Talmud's dominant position, philosophy on this question. You cannot expect reward for mitzvah in this world. Individual and community, what is that? So the Torah's relationship is not to individuals, right? It's to like the unit, the relevant unit in the Torah is the Jewish people as total. Like we as a total, we have a relationship with God. As a total, we're protected or not, and given a mission that we can do well at or fail at, right? It's us together as a collective, not us as individuals. And I think at the same time, individuals are also, at the end of the day, you stand before God and are accountable for your own actions. So there's sort of an interesting hybrid of like, you have responsibilities as an individual, you're accountable as an individual, and you, like the relevant relationship that God has with humanity is through, at least as described in the Torah, is Klal Yisrael, like a Jewish collective of Israel rather than individuals. I'm talking about questions, comments, reaction, I think I said so far. I'm super clear and compelling. It's consistent to what you've read, more or less. Okay. Next, roles of men and women. So this is, okay, so what do I want to say about that? I think there are different perspectives on the role of men and women in Orthodoxy. And I think you can sort of arrange them on how you want to generalize from the examples that you have. On the one spectrum, you say, there are mitzvot that women are exempt from performing. that men are obligated to perform. And so I'll take those mitzvot and I will generalize from them and come up with a theory of Jewish womanhood. Okay, that's like a more, okay, that's like one approach. That's like one end of the spectrum, right? Like Jewish women are like this, and men do this, and like men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Men have 613 mitzvot, women have some number fewer of mitzvot, but they have different roles. And okay, so I'm going to take the data points I have and I'm going to construct a theory of Jewish womanhood. The other end of the spectrum is to say much more technical and limited and say, look, I know that women are exempt from these 10 mitzvot. I'm not going to generalize from those examples. I don't know anything beyond what I know just from those examples. Those examples are seems a little random, seems a little arbitrary, but presumably there's some expressing some wisdom, but it's inaccessible to me. And so I'm not going to generate a grand theory about womanhood and masculinity in Judaism based on the examples I have, because I just don't know. It's just speculation, and it's not helpful speculation. Right. So that end of the spectrum will say men and women are fundamentally the same. Men and women fundamentally have the same religious stance before God as individuals standing before God. And I know there are a handful of mitzvot out of 613. There are 15 mitzvot that men and women have different connections to. It's a tiny percentage of mitzvot. So I'm not going to build a grand theory of life and what it means to be a Jewish woman and a Jewish man in the 21st century based on 15 mitzvot out of 613. So that's the other end of the spectrum. They each have advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of the more generalizable side of the spectrum is that everyone knows who they are and what God wants them to do. Okay, to paraphrase Fiddler on the Roof. Okay, that's helpful. I remember the first weeks of being married and trying to figure out with my wife who would take out the garbage, and we had no idea who was going to be whose role was that going to be in our marriage to take out the garbage, and how we were going to. Everything had to be navigated. And negotiated, right? Who does groceries, who cooks, who does laundry, and how is laundry done? Right? It's there's no sphere in which either one of us was obviously in charge. And so everything had to be negotiated. Everything was a decision, and it was hard. The advantage is, right? So that's right. So the advantage of having clear roles is everyone knows what they're supposed to do. The disadvantage is that it can be very confining for people who have different visions, right? If I'm a woman who wants to invest in her Torah scholarship or in her X, Y, and Z, whatever, I don't know, or her prayer life and the synagogue, there are ways in which it's confining to have very clear roles and narrow roles that can impede human flourishing if you feel you have a particular role that you have to fill. On the other side of the spectrum, the advantage is greater freedom, greater flexibility. The disadvantage is nobody knows what it means to be. What does it mean to be a Jewish woman or a Jewish man? No one knows. It's not, so we have these technical rules. Women don't count for a minyan. Women can't read Torah for men. Women maybe can make Havdalah, maybe not. Maybe, okay, they have an obligation to pray, but, so it's we have these data points, but what does it all mean? What do I do with it? How do I decide who does bedtime and who goes to shul for mincha marav? How do I decide who wakes the kids, feeds them breakfast, and who goes to shachrit? And what does it all mean? What do my gender-related mitzvot say about me and what I'm supposed to do in the world? And we have nothing to say to that. So I think each of the sides of the spectrum have advantages and disadvantages, and I think maybe it's, likewise every place in between. It's a spectrum. It's not a binary. But I think both of these seem like legitimate Orthodox approaches because they're both rooted in mitzvot, right? And ultimately, the mitzvot are objective. What they mean, what you think of them, that's subjective, and you got to figure out that on your own. Okay, evolution and creationism. Generally not a challenge to Jews. We never read the Torah literally. The Torah is always read. Rashi says, and I think first pasuk in the Torah, this pasuk tells us darshuni. This verse is not understandable on a plain sense level. It cries out for midrashic interpretation because it's not telling us anything literally. The Torah is not a book of geology. It's not a book of history. It's not telling us how to create the universe. It's teaching us truths about the world. That we live in a world created by God. We live in a world, right, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the core religious teachings of Sefer Breshit, of Parshat Breshit. It's not meant to tell us history or geology or anything like that, or biology or anything like that. And so I don't think there should be any sense of conflict between, like any of these scientific forms of investigating the truth and like belief in the divinity of Genesis. Genesis is not, God didn't give us the, Sefer the Torah to help us with geology. So I don't think that's an issue. And Mashiach, so we believe that the history is marching in a direction. It's not cyclical, and therefore, like the Mashiach, the Messiah, will represent this positive direction of history towards redemption, towards a reconciliation of humanity and God, Beit HaMikdash, and justice and peace for the Jewish people and for all humanity. There are very authoritative ancient traditions about Mashiach that are very rational, and the world's going to not be all that different, except these political situations will be much better. And there are depictions that are much more mystical and just imagine a transformed world. And this goes all the way back to Tanakh, to scripture itself, which has both trends. And we'll find out who's right, but both of these, trends and every space on that spectrum between the two are legitimate, Orthodox beliefs, because again, they're rooted in authoritative sources, and we ultimately don't know. And I don't think it would really. I don't think it's all that important. We have so much to do in the meantime. You have so much, so many mitzvot to do, out of love and of God and service of God. Like I think it's. To do mitzvah to bring Mashiach, I think, is problematic. I think it's a real religiously immature, problematic motivation. We should do mitzvah for their own sake. We do mitzvah because it's the right thing to do. We serve God because it's the right thing to do. We serve God out of love for God. It's not about like how it's going to help us later, right? That's not a Jewish view. That's not about serving our own needs. It's about serving God out of love and devotion. And so I think the belief in Mashiach is important because it's what makes it true that history is marching in a direction and not just a cyclical veil of tears. But ultimately, I think it's that's not it should not be something that we think about, as an overwhelming focus when we're doing mitzvah, engaged in Torah mitzvah. Questions, comments, anything, any of those last points? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.